and a new review of The Anti-Capitalist Mentality by Ludvig von Mises. You may know Mises is one of the founders of the Austrian School of Economics, which is a different kind of economics, a free market economics that came out of Mises, and you may have heard of F.A. Hayek, and later Milton Friedman, and a few other now more recent Austrian economists. This book is actually pretty short. I think it's just over 100 pages, and it's about the title, The Anti-Capitalist Mentality. Why are people anti-capitalistic? There's two reasons for that. The first reason is not everyone understands what capitalism is. Like, for example, they think that the United States is capitalism, or Canada is capitalism, but it's just not the case. There is elements of capitalism in the States. There are elements of capitalism in Canada and elsewhere in the world. There is, quite frankly, elements of capitalism in every country. But what the kind of economic outcomes and the kind of social well-being that comes out of an economic system depends on the relative balance of these things. Just as every country has a degree of capitalism, every country has a degree of socialism. The great debate that's been happening it happened over the 20th century and certainly pinnacled in various ideologies such as Nazism or National Socialism, which is what their economy was. Their political ideology was Nazism, but their economic ideology was National Socialism. And then the international socialists were, of course, the communists. But every other country since World War II has adopted a kind of socialism. It's not as if it died after World War II or it died after the Cold War. The various intellectuals that were running the show, so to speak, in those countries fled after the World War II and et cetera, and moved to Britain and moved to the United States and started spreading their ideology through those countries. And so nevertheless, over the 20th century, countries have gotten more and more socialist. So that's one observation. First of all, do we have capitalism? What is capitalism? Can you define capitalism? What does it look like? What has been the best example of capitalism? So if you can name those things, then you might be educated on the topic. But if you cannot, then hopefully you've suspended judgment on whether you think capitalism is a good thing or not. The other observation, of course, is whether we have capitalism, which I guess I've kind of mixed into the first observation. So the two are whether you understand what it is, and then you understand whether it's being advocated or fairly endorsed or not in various places. And of course, that is all up to dispute. How much socialism is ruling the United States economy versus how much capitalism is ruling it is debatable. And so Mises in the introduction opens with actually a very good quote and a very ominous quote, something that probably could be discussed quite a bit in terms of a historical argument. So he says that this is on page Roman numeral 5, just in the introduction, the first page of the introduction. He says, the people of the United States are more prosperous than the inhabitants of all other countries because their government embarked later than the governments in other parts of the world upon the policy of obstructing business. So he's suggesting there that it's inevitable, it may be inevitable that governments turn socialist, that they become more and more left-wing and more obstructionist in terms of people's private lives and people's economic lives, people's social lives and things like that. And he's saying that the reason actually that the United States is prosperous, at least our reason, is that the governments there are, the government in the States is essentially young. That's what he's saying, which I think is an interesting argument. So, because it does imply that it's a matter of time, that once the United States government becomes old, then it will just kind of slide into socialism. And I think that's been quite a worldly phenomenon. If you look at the various economies around the world, that they have slowly been sliding towards this kind of ideology of protectionism and welfarism and things like that. It's very difficult to find any counterpoint to that. Of course, other than the countries that are already so far in, that a small move to free market policies looks like a miracle. And places like China, when Hong Kong was liberated and things like that, those might be examples. But otherwise, most of the rest of the world is moving, if it can, moving towards more of welfarism and things like that, statist policies. It also implies that a fresher government is a government that could be more peaceful and more economically peaceful or economically unobstructionist, more free economically for their people. And so this might also suggest that governments that engage in revolution every now and then could again be trying to renew themselves. And the older governments, the more imposed and the more establishment governments, the regular dictatorships, the kind of like in Cuba, they're just ruled by a family, or Saudi Arabia. These are the kinds of governments that are going to be imposing far more on their citizens, and they're not fresh and new governments that may leave much of things alone so people can prosper.